It was supposed to be just another honorary ceremony. But when the old man from Africa took the stage at Harvard, silence fell upon thousands. He did not come to impress anyone. He came to remind them of what humanity had forgotten. That day, laughter met wisdom, and the world listened in awe. It was September 18th, 1998. The air in Cambridge, Massachusetts, was crisp, touched by autumn's early breath. At Harvard University, one of the world's most powerful academic institutions, students, professors, and leaders from across nations gathered to witness something extraordinary. The red and gold banners of the university fluttered under a pale sky as anticipation built in the crowd. They were not there for an academic debate or a lecture. They were there to see a man who had turned prison into a classroom and pain into purpose. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, the newly retired president of South Africa, walked slowly toward the podium. His steps carried the weight of 27 years of imprisonment and the triumph of a soul that refused to bow. Harvard was conferring upon him an honorary doctorate, an honor reserved for legends like Churchill and Washington. Yet Mandela's calm smile seemed to transcend the grandeur of the ceremony. He had faced death and chosen forgiveness. Now he stood before the Western world, not as a victim, but as a teacher. As the crowd roared, Mandela began with humor, disarming every formality. He spoke of a phone call where a woman had once insulted him for not having passed his matric. The audience burst into laughter, but beneath that laughter was reverence. Here was a man who had no bitterness in his voice, only the quiet authority of someone who had truly lived. The stage that day became more than a platform. It became a mirror, reflecting both the greatness and humility that defined true leadership. Behind Mandela's calm eyes lay decades of inner conflict, the kind that breaks most men long before it teaches them. He had tasted humiliation in its rawest form, stripped of power, comfort, and even identity. On Robben Island, the sound of the ocean was both a torment and a reminder of what lay beyond his reach. The salt wind carried freedom, yet every gust hit the iron bars that confined him. There, he was not Mr. President or Madiba. He was prisoner 466/64. And yet, within those walls, something profound was being forged, not anger, but endurance. He wrestled with himself every dawn when the guards shouted orders and mocked his age. He fought the temptation to hate, to curse, to surrender to bitterness. Each day was a mirror reflecting the depth of his patience and the limits of his pride. He realized that true freedom could never be taken by force. It lived in the mind and the heart, in the quiet decision to stay human, when everything around tried to turn him into something less. Now, standing at Harvard, surrounded by applause and admiration, Mandela carried the invisible scars of that long spiritual war. The crowd heard jokes and laughter, but his humor was born from pain, a bomb forged in years of isolation. When he recalled being called a backward man or a stupid old man, his smile disarmed his listeners, but behind it was the wisdom of someone who had seen humanity's cruelty up close and had chosen mercy over vengeance. His greatest victory was not political, it was internal. He had conquered himself. In his calm voice, the world heard the sound of a man who had turned suffering into grace. The conflict was never between black and white, power and oppression. It was between hatred and forgiveness. And that day, before Harvard, forgiveness stood triumphant. As Mandela's speech unfolded, a transformation swept through the hall. The playful tone that had once drawn laughter began to fade, replaced by a steady, deliberate gravity. He no longer spoke as a guest of honor. He spoke as the conscience of a generation. Freedom, he warned, means nothing if it is not accompanied by food, shelter, and dignity. The words hung in the air like a solemn verdict. The applause that followed his earlier humor dissolved into a silence that carried the weight of realization. Students shifted in their seats. Professors lowered their eyes. The truth was no longer comfortable. It was convicting. He spoke of the widening gulf between the rich and the poor, not in figures or theories, but through lived experience. He had seen children grow up without hope, families broken by poverty, nations crippled by greed. He told them that the promise of democracy was hollow if it did not fill the stomachs of the hungry. A vote, he said softly, is not enough to heal an empty soul. Every syllable drew a line between privilege and purpose. Turning his gaze to Harvard scholars, he reminded them that knowledge was not meant to elevate the few, but to serve the many. Education, he said, was sacred, a light that loses its purity when kept only for oneself. He asked them, almost gently, "What will you do for those who cannot stand here with us?" The question struck deeper than any applause could reach. Then, with calm authority, he spoke the words that would define that moment. The greatest challenge is not political, it is moral. The room held its breath. His voice, though soft, carried more power than any thunder. The laughter of earlier minutes was gone. In its place, an awakening. And what happened next would silence the room completely. As his speech continued, Mandela's tone shifted from playful to profound. He spoke of the widening gap between the rich and the poor, not as an economist, but as a man who had seen both sides of injustice. Freedom, he warned, means nothing if it is not accompanied by food, shelter, and dignity. His words pierced through the comfort of the hall. The laughter faded into reflection. He reminded Harvard scholars that knowledge without compassion was hollow. That education was not a privilege. It was a responsibility. Around the world, people had supported his cause for freedom. But now he challenged them to look deeper. What would they do for those still trapped in poverty and ignorance? Each sentence built upon the last, carrying the weight of a prophet speaking to a generation of thinkers. The tension rose not through anger, but through truth. The greatest challenge, he said, is not political, it is moral. His words drew the invisible line between power and purpose. Harvard's elite leaned in. For once, they weren't just hearing a statesman. They were hearing a conscience speaking to humanity itself. But what happened next would silence the room completely. Mandela paused. The hall, vast and filled with dignitaries, seemed to shrink into silence. His eyes, deep and reflective, scanned the faces before him. Young students full of ambition, leaders dressed in certainty, and scholars shaped by privilege. He took a breath, and his voice softened into something almost sacred. "I have seen men die for the right to be human," he said, "and I have seen nations forget what it means to be free." Every word carried not the rhythm of speech, but the truth of a life lived for others. He spoke of his dream, not just for South Africa, but for all humanity. If we can at last look upon our own country as one in which citizens, regardless of race or creed, share equal rights, he said, then we do so with gratitude toward all who believe with us. The crowd listened, spellbound, realizing they were witnessing more than a moment in history. They were part of a moral awakening. Then his tone deepened. He spoke of a painful reality, a world divided not only by borders but by conscience. Democracy, he said, means little to those who go to bed hungry. Liberty means nothing when the stomach is empty and the mind uneducated. His words struck like quiet thunder, each syllable revealing a truth too often ignored. He turned his gaze toward the distance, as if speaking to generations yet unborn. "The disparity between North and South," he said slowly, "is not only in wealth. It is in understanding." In that instant, every title, every degree, every accolade in that hall seemed small. For the first time, Harvard did not see a prisoner or a politician. It saw a teacher of the soul. That was the moment applause turned into reverence. The old man from Africa had not come to receive an honor. He had come to bestow one upon the conscience of the world. When Mandela finished speaking, the applause erupted like a storm breaking over still waters, thunderous, emotional, unrestrained. Yet as the sound filled the hall, it was not the applause that carried his message. It was the silence that followed. For within that silence, hearts were moved and minds were awakened. He had not promised an easy world, nor painted a dream of perfection. He had simply held up a mirror, one that forced humanity to confront its own reflection. Progress, he reminded them, was empty without compassion. Achievement was hollow without empathy. His words lingered long after he stepped down from the podium. Professors who spent lifetimes studying power realized they had just witnessed its purest form, power without ego. Students who had come to see a symbol of history left, having met the essence of humanity. He had shown them that leadership was not about dominance, but about service, not about victory, but about purpose. Forgiveness, he taught, was not a sign of surrender. It was the ultimate act of strength. As the crowd dispersed, The evening light fell across the Harvard yard like a benediction. The air carried an unfamiliar stillness, as if the earth itself paused to remember. Mandela's laughter, gentle yet knowing, seemed to echo through the corridors, a reminder that humility could be louder than any speech, and that grace could outlive power. That day at Harvard was not about honor or ceremony. It was about awakening. Mandela had shown the world that greatness is not measured by how high one rises, but by how many are lifted along the way. He had reminded a generation that wisdom does not speak in anger. It speaks in patience, in laughter, and in love. So today, when you hear his words or see that calm smile, ask yourself, would you still forgive if you had lost everything? Would you still smile if life had tried to silence you? Because perhaps that, and only that, is what true freedom really means. And so, on that autumn day, one man stood before the world and taught it to listen again, not to power, not to pride, but to truth. Because some stories are not told in textbooks. They are carried in the hearts of those who refuse to forget. Because some stories were never told until now. Subscribe to Unforgettable Souls for more stories that history almost forgot, and souls the world must remember.